for we will take questions at the end. So I will pass now to our next speaker, who's Barry Aitken, who's an ethics fellow with the Alan Turing Institute. And Barry's research has a particular focus on the social and ethical dimensions of data usage and artificial intelligence. So over to you, Barry. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, I'm Barry Aitken, and as Kate said, I'm an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. The Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for AI and Data Science. So in my role as an ethics fellow, my work examines how we can maximise the value and benefits of data across society, while also developing approaches that can anticipate potential negative impacts and address those within data practices. Before working at the Alan Turing Institute, I worked previously in the Far Institute of Health Informatics Research and the Scottish Health Informatics Programme. And in both of those institutes, my work was around public engagement with data-intensive health research. So in this presentation today, I'm going to be drawing on the experience from all of those roles and some reflections from that experience. And my presentation today is focusing on the role of best practice, public and patient involvement and engagement, which is a mouthful, so PPIE, best practice and PPIE for establishing a social license for data-intensive health research. So I'm going to cover a few things in the next 10 minutes. Firstly, I'm going to set out what a social license is and why we need one for data-intensive health research. I'm then going to discuss the role of PPIE in establishing a social license and how we might go about doing that. And finally, I'm going to set out some principles to underpin best practice in PPIE. And these principles come from a consensus statement, which was established in 2019, which brought together international experience, international expertise in the field to establish core principles to underpin best practice in PPIE or data-intensive health research. And finally, I'll end with some thoughts on looking ahead and considerations for future best practice in the field. So firstly, what is a social license? Well, a social license recognises that there can be meaningful differences between what is legally permissible and what is socially acceptable. So when we think about data practices, legal compliance or regulatory compliance is kind of the minimum standard. If we're thinking about ethical data practices, compliance with the law is really the minimum. That's what you must and what you must not do in terms of collecting people's data, processing data, using or sharing data. But ethical data practices require us to go beyond legal compliance, and establishing a social license recognises that what is socially acceptable might be beyond legal compliance into thinking about how we align with public expectations or societal values around how data is collected, used, shared, or used for secondary purposes. So a social license is granted by a community of stakeholders. And in the context of data-intensive health research, a community of stakeholders might be, everybody whose data is potentially used in the research. And of course, that really brings in quite large populations. Stakeholders might also be everybody who might potentially benefit or be impacted by data-intensive health research. And again, we're thinking about really large populations and really the public generally. But social license is intangible and unwritten. It's not something that you get your social license and you can demonstrate that you have it, and there are clearly defined kind of terms under which you hold that license. It's untangible and unwritten. It's based on relationships with stakeholders and a sense of acceptability or trustworthiness of data practices. But establishing and maintaining that social license for data practices may be essential for the sustainability and legitimacy of particular data practices or data-intensive health research more broadly. So why do we need a social license for data-intensive health research? I think we can all probably think of some controversies in recent years around data practices or proposed data practices in relation to data-intensive health research. There have been quite a number of high-profile public controversies. I mean, going back a few years as care.data, there was controversies around Google's DeepMind accessing and processing NHS patient data at the Royal Free Hospital, and many more examples of controversies around data practices or access to NHS patient data for research processes. So it's clear that public acceptance cannot be taken for granted. We can't assume that the public are supportive of data practices, even where these may have clear public benefits or benefits in terms of patient care or research outcomes. But none of this research is really, really important data-intensive health research. None of it would be possible without the public or without the assent of the public. And it's important to always bear in mind that the public are both the intended beneficiaries of the research, in that this research is going to improve health outcomes, include improved delivery of service or understandings of health and illness. The public are the beneficiaries of the research, but the public are also the enablers of the research. None of this research would be possible without access to data which comes from the public, which relates to patients and public's lives and daily lives. So we need public assent to enable this research to go ahead. And we need a social license to ensure that this research has legitimacy, that it is sustainable and acceptable. But importantly, establishing a social license for data practices is not just about avoiding opposition. And I think often there could be a tendency to think about this as being, finding out what concerns are and how we can address them, or reducing opposition, potential opposition to data practices. Actually, this is equally about maximizing the value and maximizing the benefits of data across society, and finding out in what ways can we maximize those benefits across society to align with societal expectations and public values. And that's really important. So how can a social license be established for data-intensive health research? A social license is underpinned by relationships of trust. And it's really important to note that those relationships of trust can't be manufactured or can't be created in a kind of through a one-off activity. Rather, trust needs to be earned over time and through ongoing activities and relationships. And it requires continual work. It's not something that can be secured on a one-off basis. That trust will continually be negotiated and renegotiated and can change through changing context, changing experiences, changing relationships. So it requires ongoing engagement over time. And it requires public engagement to ensure that data practices align with societal values and expectations. So we need dialogue and conversation to find out what those values and expectations are and how we can match them, how we can align with them in data practices. It requires public concerns to be meaningfully addressed rather than managed. So it's not simply about finding out what concerns are and how we can alleviate them or how we can appease them or what messages we need to communicate to minimize opposition or concern and to increase support. But it requires us to go much further and really address what those concerns are and ensure that they are properly addressed in data practices. So meaningful public engagement is the foundation for a social license. Now, I just wanted to show this slide because this slide sets out some rationales that underpin approaches to public engagement. And it's clear that in recent years, there are many kind of institutional commitments to public engagement, patient and public involvement and engagement with data-intensive health research, both in the UK and internationally. And we often hear commitments about the importance of public involvement and importance of public engagement to inform data-intensive health research or in relation to data-intensive health research. But these commitments can be underpinned by very different rationales and very different motivations. So some of this is underpinned by a normative rationale, which sees public involvement and engagement as being simply the right thing to do. If we're using people's data, those people should have a say in how that data is used. They should be involved in the process. There's a moral imperative to engage people within those processes. And then there are instrumental rationales, which see engagement as being a means to a particular goal or a means to a particular end. So engagement can be a way of increasing support, increasing uptake of a policy in relation to more kind of clinical trials. It might be to increase involvement or recruitment within those processes. So it's a means to a particular goal. Instrumental rationales run the risk of leading to kind of tokenistic approaches, where it's seen as kind of legitimating decisions that have already been made, or serving the organization's goals rather than necessarily what the public's interests are within that. And finally, substantive rationales view engagement as being opportunities to improve the projects and improve outcomes, leading to benefits for participants and wider society. And this is very much aligned with this idea of establishing a social license for data-intensive health research. I think often the kind of rhetoric around commitments to public involvement and engagement kind of reflect an instrumental rationale in that the language is often around restoring public trust or building public trust. And we hear this a lot each time there's a controversy around data practices. There's often the language of engaging the public to restore trust or build trust. I think restore trust is challenging, and it assumes that there was at some point unambiguous public trust, which I'm not sure has ever actually been the case, and I think the relationships are more complex than that. But it also puts the emphasis on the public response rather than actually the data practices. Whereas more substantive rationales would focus on not the response, but actually how do we establish trustworthiness, and what can we learn from publics? What can we learn from engaging with publics in conversations around data practices to understand what it would mean to be trustworthy and to demonstrate trustworthiness in data practices? And I think that's a really important and meaningful difference in approach, and it leads to different ideas of why we're engaging, how we're engaging, and what it would mean for engagement to be successful. So I wanted to quickly run through the principles to underpin best practice in public and patient involvement and engagement with data-intensive health research, which was set out in this consensus statement that was published in 2019. So this consensus statement was developed, as I said, I previously worked at the Far Institute of Health Informatics Research, and this consensus statement was led by the Far Institute and the public engagement teams of the Far Institute. And it emerged through a process which engaged 31 participants with expertise in PPI relating to data-intensive health research, coming from the UK, Ireland, Australia, Canada, Finland, and the Netherlands. And we reflected on current best practice in public involvement and engagement, international experiences in the field, to develop a set of 8 principles to underpin international best practice in this field. And so I'm going to run through each of those principles quite briefly now. So the consensus statement sets out that PPI relating to data-intensive health research should have institutional buy-in. This was the first principle set out in the consensus statement, and it's really, really crucial. While we see at all kinds of levels, at least rhetorical commitments to the importance of public involvement and engagement relating to data-intensive health research, we need to go much further than rhetorical commitments to have meaningful institutional buy-in in the value of public engagement and involvement. Even if we have, the best methods, the most inclusive approaches to engagement, if there's no institutional buy-in to act on the recommendations, the outcomes, or the findings of public engagement and involvement, the value is not realized. The value is not fully realized. So we need real institutional commitments and buy-in to value the importance of engagement and the value of the outcomes of those processes to really affect change. And so this is absolutely crucial. The second principle is that public involvement and engagement should have clarity of purpose. And that means that this is important to set realistic expectations of what engagement is going to can achieve, also what the limitations of the engagement exercise might be, and to value people's time in participating by being able to clearly communicate what the purpose of the engagement is, what it can achieve, and what the opportunities to affect change are. PPIE should be transparent. That is both transparent in relation to the data practices that it relates to, but also transparent about the purposes and limitations of the engagement exercise. It should involve two-way communication. So, while awareness raising or information provision activities are important to inform dialogue and inform deliberation, public engagement requires it to be a conversation and a dialogue. So it's not just about telling publics what's happening or or about governance processes or providing reassurances, but also, more importantly, having that conversation and understanding what people's values are, what their expectations are, what their concerns are, and how we can involve that, how we can reflect that in data practices. PPIE should be inclusive and accessible to broad publics. This is both about, practical accessibility requirements in terms of accessibility or venues, accessibility in terms of providing, translation and accessibility requirements to enable participants to participate in those processes, and also considerations around whether there should be online approaches, in-person approaches, or a combination of both to ensure accessibility to diverse publics, but also inclusive and accessible to different perspectives and different ideas. And it's really important that we include dissensus and different perspectives and challenging ideas in engagement processes. Consensus isn't necessarily a desirable outcome or a desirable feature of these processes. We want to have exchange of ideas, different perspectives, different ideas within those processes, and we need to be inclusive and incorporate those differing perspectives throughout engagement processes. PPIE should be ongoing, shouldn't just be one-off activities. It should be a strategy to embed engagement throughout the whole processes and governance, research practices throughout the process, and to be an ongoing series of activities rather than a single activity. It should be designed to produce impact, and this relates to the institutional buy-in. Public involvement and engagement needs to have mechanisms to ensure that it is not just a talking shop, but it actually affects change. It does something, it has a clear purpose. And finally, it should be evaluated. And evaluation always comes last, but of course, evaluation should be built in and incorporated from the earliest stages and from design stages. And I think evaluation is really key because we need to build up an evidence base of what's working well, what challenges are in involvement and engagement, and what are the lessons to be learned. And that's really important to establish best practice, but also to increase understanding of the value and impacts of engagement. And it builds and it relates back to the point of ensuring institutional buy-in. I'm going to skip over this slide, which is around evaluation. I could perhaps come back to it in discussion if of interest. But just to close, looking ahead, what this means. Public and patient involvement and engagement is vital to establish and maintain a social license for data-intensive health research. And we know that this is absolutely crucial. But to establish best practice in public involvement and engagement, we need not just innovation and methods, but there's a lot of creativity and innovation and methods of engagement, but we also need culture change to underpin meaningful institutional commitments to realizing the benefits and the value of engagement, to go beyond rhetorical commitments and beyond tokenism to actually have meaningful, effective engagement. And developing best practice in public involvement and engagement also requires critical conversations about the successes, the failures, and the lessons learned along the way. And that's why I think this webinar today is really exciting, to do that, to have these conversations and to really think about what best practice in this field really means and how we can pursue and advance that. And I feel I may have gone over time, so I apologise. These are my details if anyone would like to get in touch afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. That's really important messages and concepts being introduced there for this session. But in the interest of time, we will have to move on now.